The smell of smoke reached Susanna Merriweather before she saw the orange tongue of flame licking the night sky, and something cold and ancient moved through her chest the moment she understood what she was looking at. That was her fence line, her posts, her wire. Her 2 years of backbreaking labor stretched across 340 acres of New Mexico Territory grassland that she had earned with bleeding palms, and a deed she kept under her floorboards because she trusted locked drawers about as much as she trusted Colt Draven. She stood in the yard outside her ranch house with one boot on and one boot dangling from her left hand, the laces still untied, and she watched the fire crawl west along her boundary like a slow and deliberate sentence being written against her will. The betrayal of it turned her stomach to stone, because this was not an accident. Dry lightning did not move in a line. Dry lightning did not conveniently begin at the precise corner post that marked the disputed edge between her land and the Draven parcel. This was a message. She threw her boot on. She did not run back inside for her coat. She crossed the yard to the barn in the same fierce, ground-eating stride that had carried her through every hard thing that had ever been asked of her, unlatched the barn door and began saddling her gray mare, Clover, by the light of a single lantern. Her hands moved fast and sure, buckles clicking, cinch pulled tight. She did not cry. She pressed her lips together until they were a pale, flat line, and she thought with absolute precision about what she needed. Lumber. New posts. Wire could wait. She had a partial roll near the east shed, but she needed posts before Draven's cattle crossed that boundary, and she lost not just her fencing but her legal claim to the grass her own herd depended on for the winter. If his cattle grazed her range and she could not prove the boundary, the county magistrate would side with the bigger name and the fuller pocketbook, and Colt Draven's pocketbook was considerably fuller than her own. She was in the saddle and moving before the thought finished forming in her mind. She did not light a second lantern. The moon was 3/4 full, and she knew this land well enough to ride it blind. Clover broke into a canter at the gentle press of her heels, and the two of them moved through the dark like water, fast and purposeful, and absolutely without hesitation. It was only later, when she was half a mile down the road toward Casado Springs, and already calculating the cost of lumber at Hendrick's Mill, that she thought about the man who lived at the edge of the property she was riding past. The man who had arrived in Casado Springs 4 months ago with a wagon full of carpentry tools, and a quiet manner, and a dark past that nobody in town could quite account for. The man whose name she had heard a dozen times but whose eyes she had deliberately avoided because she suspected, with a woman's particular instinct for such things, that meeting them directly would cost her something she was not prepared to spend. Paul Keene. And that was when she heard it. A lamp lighting in the window of the modest house set back from the road, a door opening, a voice cutting through the New Mexico night with a calmness that somehow made her feel as though she had been caught doing something extraordinary. "Miss Merriweather, you are riding at 2 in the morning with smoke on the wind. Do you need help?" She pulled Clover to a stop and turned in the saddle and looked at him for the first time in full. She had been right to avoid it. Paul Keene stood in his doorway in unlaced boots and a shirt that was not yet fully buttoned, a man who had clearly been woken by the smell of smoke rather than already standing watch. His dark hair was short and slightly disordered. His face was the kind of face that carried its history openly, a jaw that had been clenched against too many things for too many years, eyes that were calm in the way that very still water is calm, still because the deep current runs underneath where nobody can see it. He was perhaps 32. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that matters, direct and serious and without performance. "My neighbor burned my fence line," she said. The words came out flat and final and honest. "I am riding for lumber before he decides his cattle need a morning walk." Paul Keene looked at her for exactly 3 seconds. Then he bent and began lacing his boots. She blinked. "I did not ask you to come." "You did not have to." He reached back inside the door and pulled out a jacket. "Hendricks opens his mill yard at 6. We have 4 hours. I know a shortcut through the Ortega land that will cut 40 minutes off the ride, and I have a wagon I can have hitched in 8 minutes." He paused. "Unless you prefer to manage lumber on horseback." She could not think of a single logical argument against this, and she was a woman who prided herself on logical arguments, so she said the only true thing available to her. 8 minutes, she said. "I will time you." He was ready in 7. The wagon moved through the dark along the shortcut he had promised, and Susanna Merriweather sat on the wagon bench beside Paul Keene, with 6 inches of New Mexico night air between them, and thought about the nature of hidden motives. Because nobody did something like this without wanting something in return. She had learned that lesson the hard way in Kansas, and she had brought it with her when she came west at 26, deed in hand and absolute in her determination to owe nothing to nobody. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, when they were past the Ortega land and the stars were thick above them. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because you are going to need a second pair of hands to load green timber before dawn, and you look like someone who would rather break her back than ask for help. That is an observation about me, not an answer about yourself." Fair enough. He kept his eyes on the road. The horses moved at a steady trot. "I came to Casado Springs because I needed to be somewhere that nobody knew my name. I have been here 4 months and nobody has tried to involve me in anything. Tonight you rode past my window at 2 in the morning with smoke behind you and the look of a woman who intends to fight the whole world before breakfast." A brief silence. "It reminded me of someone I used to be." She sat with that for a moment. "Who did you used to be?" "Someone who would have burned a fence line." The wagon wheels turned. The night moved around them. Susanna Merriweather looked at Paul Keene's profile against the dark sky and felt something shift in the geography of her internal landscape, something tectonic and quiet and impossible to reverse. She did not pursue it further. Not yet. The story of how Susanna Merriweather came to own 340 acres in the New Mexico Territory in the year 1881 was not a simple one. And it was not a story she told often, because the people who heard it tended to look at her with either pity or skepticism, and she had no use for either. She had been born in Ohio to a schoolteacher father, and a mother who had died of fever before Susanna was old enough to properly remember her face. She had educated herself aggressively, reading everything her father owned and then everything the town library owned, and then writing to publishers in Cincinnati for books they did not stock, which was how she had come across a government pamphlet about the Homestead Act and the opportunities it represented for settlers in the Western Territories. She had been 22 when she first read that pamphlet. She had been 26 when her father died and left her with a modest inheritance, no family, no particular reason to stay in Ohio, and a very particular reason to go west. The reason was called James Aldridge, and he had been engaged to her for 2 years and had spent those 2 years being everything she thought a man ought to be right up until the moment he wasn't, which was the moment he told her that he had decided to marry the banker's daughter instead. Because the banker's daughter came with a house and Susanna Merriweather came with books and opinions, and a habit of being right about things that men preferred to be right about themselves. She had returned his ring in a steady hand, packed her father's books and her own considerable determination, and boarded a train west. The land she homesteaded in Lincoln County, New Mexico Territory, was not beautiful in any way that a painting would capture. It was high desert grassland, all sage and juniper and red earth, and a sky so enormous it pressed down on a person like a friendly hand, and it was hard and honest and absolutely indifferent to whether she succeeded or failed, which she had found, to her own surprise, deeply comforting after years of being surrounded by people with opinions about how she ought to live. She had built the house herself with the help of 2 men she had hired from Casado Springs and paid in cash. She had strung her first fence line with the help of nobody. She had purchased 12 head of cattle with half her inheritance, learned everything there was to know about grazing and water rights and winter feeding from books, and from the old Mexican rancher, Emilio Vargas, who ran the adjacent parcel to the north, and who had looked at her when she first arrived with the measured assessment of a man deciding whether something was worth his time, and then decided that it was. Emilio Vargas had taught her things that no book contained. He had taught her how to read the grass, how to know when the water table was falling, how to predict a hard winter by the behavior of the cattle in September. He had also taught her, in his patient and indirect way, about the particular dangers of the Draven family. Colt Draven ran the largest ranch in the county. He was 43 years old, a widower, and a man who understood property as a language and spoke it exclusively. He had been trying to acquire Susanna's parcel for as long as she had owned it. First he had come with an offer, reasonable on its face and predatory in its terms, which she had declined. Then he had come with a second offer, larger and more aggressive, which she had also declined. Then he had begun a campaign of smaller pressures, a dispute about a shared water source, a letter to the county magistrate questioning the validity of her original survey, the deliberate placement of his own fence line 3 feet inside her eastern boundary, which she had documented and reported and eventually won. Each time she won, Colt Draven's manner had become a little more opaque and a little less polite, and Emilio Vargas had told her, the last time she had seen him, which had been 3 weeks before he suffered a stroke that left him confined to his bed in the care of his daughter, that Draven was a man who did not accept the word no from anyone and had never yet been made to. "You are going to have to make him," Emilio had said, with the certainty of a man who has watched the territory for 40 years. She had nodded. She had not known how. Now, sitting in a wagon beside Paul Keene in the hours before dawn, watching the darkness thin at the edge of the eastern horizon, she understood that Draven had finally moved from pressure to open aggression, and that the rules between them had changed. The Hendricks Mill was a half-built operation on the South Fork of the Casado Creek, run by a large and fundamentally decent man named Walter Hendricks, who had been milling lumber in the territory for 6 years, and who opened his yard, as Paul had said, at 6 in the morning. They arrived at 20 minutes past 5 and waited in the wagon while the sky turned from black to deep violet to the pale washed-out blue of early morning. Walter Hendricks came out of his house at 5:45, saw them in the yard, and waved without surprise. He was a man accustomed to the odd hours that necessity produced in the territory. "Miss Merriweather," he said as he unlocked the yard gate, "what brings you out before breakfast?" "Fence posts," she said. "As many as you can sell me." "Cedar if you have it." He looked at her face with the directness of a man who does not waste time. "Trouble with Draven." She said nothing, which was answer enough. Walter Hendricks looked at Paul Keene for a moment with an expression she could not entirely read, something between assessment and something warmer. "Mr. Keene," he said, nodding. "Walter," Paul said. She looked between them. "You know each other." "Small town," Paul said simply. They loaded the wagon together, all 3 of them, working in the morning quiet with the efficiency of people who understand physical labor as a form of conversation. Cedar posts, good straight ones that would last a decade if set properly, loaded length by length into the wagon bed. Susanna paid in cash from the envelope she kept folded in her jacket pocket, the same envelope she had learned to carry always because necessity did not wait for a trip to the bank. Walter Hendricks pressed her hand when she paid him. "You want me to send word to the magistrate? I can testify about what time you came and what you needed, if it goes to a legal dispute." "I will let you know," she said. "Thank you, Walter." She climbed back onto the wagon bench. Paul Keene climbed up beside her. The wagon was considerably heavier now, the horses working harder, and they moved back through the morning light at a slower pace. "You should have woken me before riding out," he said after they had gone perhaps a mile. She turned to look at him. "Why?" "Because Draven does not do things alone. If he burned your fence last night, he had men helping him, and those men know you are going to respond. The road between your ranch and this mill is the obvious route." She had not thought of that. The realization that she had not thought of it was more unsettling than the original threat, because Susanna Merriweather thought of things. That was her primary defense and had been for years. You think they would come after me on the road? I think Draven is moving to a different stage of this, Paul said. He was quiet for a moment, watching the road ahead. I know men like him. I have known men like him in contexts that were considerably worse than a county land dispute. He paused. He is not trying to inconvenience you anymore. He is trying to break you. That is a different thing. I know, she said. And then, because honesty was the only currency she had ever trusted, it frightens me. He looked at her. The morning light was full now, golden and direct, and it fell on his face and showed her things she had not been able to see in the dark. There was a scar along his left jaw, thin and old, the kind left by something sharp a long time ago. His eyes were gray, a particular shade of gray that was not cold at all, but rather the color of clouds that are about to release something. Good, he said quietly. It should frighten you. That is how you will stay sharp. Is that what you told yourself when you were in circumstances worse than a land dispute? Another silence, longer this time. No, he said. I stopped being frightened at a certain point, and that was when I made my worst decisions. She sat with that for the rest of the ride. Back at the ranch, with the sun fully up and the burned fence line visible as a black scar along the western boundary, a truth she could not keep hidden from herself anymore, they unloaded the cedar posts in the yard, and she stood looking at the damage in the full light of day. It was worse than she had thought from the dark. Not only the posts but the wire, melted and warped and useless, and the grass around the line scorched brown in a strip 20 feet wide. The fire had stopped short of her winter hay storage by perhaps 300 yards, which she did not believe was an accident any more than the fire itself had been. He was showing her how close he could get. I will help you set these today, Paul said from beside her. You have your own work, she said. I build things for other people, he said. Today I can build something for you. She turned to look at him, and for the first time felt the full weight of the situation she was standing in, the burned land, the morning light, the man beside her with his unlaced boots from 2 in the morning, and the quiet manner that concealed something she was beginning to understand was not softness at all but its opposite, a kind of concentrated stillness that had been forged by something very hard. Why did you really leave wherever you came from? She asked. He met her eyes without evasion. Because I did something that needed to be undone and I could not undo it while I was still there. What did you do? I worked for a man like Colt Draven, he said. In Colorado, 7 years ago, I was young and poor and I told myself that following orders was not the same as choosing them. His jaw tightened very slightly. I was wrong. She held his gaze. What happened? A family lost their land, he said. Because of work I did. Survey falsifications, witness intimidation. Small things that added up to the only thing that mattered, which was that people who had built something were left with nothing. He looked out at the burned fence line. I left when I understood what I had been part of. I spent 3 years trying to find a way to fix it that did not exist, and then I came here. To start over, to be someone different. He looked back at her. I have been doing carpentry work for 4 months and keeping to myself and not asking anything of anyone. And last night, you rode past my window, and I saw what I would have helped cause, happening to someone who did not deserve it, and I decided that keeping to myself had limits. Susanna Merriweather had spent 5 years being careful about what she let herself feel. She had built those careful boundaries as deliberately and methodically as she had built her fence lines, and she was aware, with the same precision that had served her in every practical matter of her life, that something was happening to those boundaries now. Something was moving through them the way fire moves through dry grass, not destructive but transforming, changing the nature of the ground. She said, I would like your help setting these posts. He nodded. He picked up a post. She picked up another, and they walked together toward the burned line. They worked all morning and into the afternoon, and it was the most companionable silence Susanna had experienced in 5 years of solitude. He worked with a carpenter's precision, measuring the spacing between posts with a cord, tamping each one into the ground with a level and a post maul until it stood perfectly vertical. She followed behind with the wire, twisting it into place with pliers and strong hands. They did not talk much, but the talking they did was efficient and necessary, and felt somehow more intimate than conversations that filled all the available air. At midday she made coffee and biscuits in the ranch kitchen, and they ate sitting on the steps of the house with the sunlight warm on the yard, and she asked him about carpentry, and he asked her about cattle, and they talked about the territory with the ease of two people who had each spent a long time living inside their own heads, and had forgotten, briefly, how pleasant it was to have someone to think out loud with. She noticed things about him that she would not have predicted from a first impression. He was funny, in a dry and understated way that she almost missed the first time, and then did not miss at all. He had strong opinions about the proper construction of a fence post that he delivered with such absolute seriousness that she had to look away to keep from smiling. When she said something that was true and interesting, he did not argue for the sake of it, which was rarer than it should have been among the men she had known. In the afternoon, while they were working on the last section of fence, she heard the sound of hoofbeats from the direction of the Draven property. She straightened and looked. 3 riders. She recognized the man in the center, not Colt Draven himself, but his ranch foreman, a weathered and unpleasant man named Haskell who had the eyes of someone who kept count of everything and owed apologies for nothing. Paul Keene did not straighten. He continued driving a post with measured strokes, but she had the impression, watching him, that his awareness of the 3 riders was as complete as her own. Haskell pulled his horse to a stop at the edge of the burned line. He looked at the new posts. He looked at Susanna. He looked at Paul Keene. He did not look at anything with particular surprise. "Mr. Draven wanted me to check on the boundary situation," Haskell said, with the satisfaction of a man delivering a rehearsed line. "The boundary is where it has always been," Susanna said. "As I believe you know, there seems to have been some kind of fire along here." "Yes," she said, "there does." Haskell's eyes moved to Paul Keene, who had stopped driving the post and was standing with the maul resting against his shoulder, watching Haskell with an expression that was entirely calm and entirely unreadable. "You the carpenter?" Haskell said. "Yes," Paul said. "Funny time of day for carpentry work." "Is it?" Paul said. It was not a question. A silence stretched between them with the particular texture of a silence that contains a threat being carefully assembled. Then Haskell shifted his horse and looked back at Susanna. "Mr. Draven says his offer on this parcel stands, in case you've had a chance to reconsider the value of holding out." Susanna Merriweather looked at Haskell with the full force of 5 years of accumulated determination and said, "Tell Mr. Draven that my answer is the same as it has always been, and that I would appreciate it if he would stop communicating through fires, since I find the method less than clear." Haskell's face went flat. He turned his horse, and the 3 riders moved back the way they had come. Paul Keene watched them go. "He will report that to Draven," he said. "I know. And Draven will escalate. I know that too." He set the post maul down against the new fence line and turned to look at her fully. In the afternoon light, with the burned land behind him and the new cedar post standing straight and clean, there was something in his expression that she recognized, not because she had seen it in anyone else, but because she had felt it in herself at moments when the situation was large and the choice was clear, and the cost of choosing right was not yet known. "What is your plan?" he asked. "I have a deed and a proper survey," she said. "I am going to document every incident of harassment and intimidation going back to when it started. I am going to take it to the county magistrate in Santa Fe, not the local one who Draven has in his pocket, the territorial one." He nodded slowly. "That will take time. Everything that is worth doing takes time. In the meantime, Draven will not stop." "No," she said, "he will not." He looked at the fence line they had rebuilt together, 200 feet of cedar posts set in good hard ground, and she watched him make a decision she could see in the way his shoulders settled slightly, the way a man settles when he has stopped arguing with himself about something. I have some documentation of my own, he said. From Colorado, names, dates, methods. It is the kind of thing a territorial magistrate might find useful as context for how these operations work. She stared at him. You kept records. I kept records because I thought one day I might be able to undo some of the damage. I have been waiting for the right moment. He met her eyes. This feels like the right moment. The feeling that moved through Susanna Merriweather at that moment was complex enough that it would have taken her the rest of the afternoon to name all its components. There was gratitude in it, and caution, and the particular warmth of recognizing that someone is more than you initially calculated, and underneath all of that, running like the deep current she had glimpsed in his eyes, something that was not yet ready to be named but was unmistakably there. She said, "You would be putting yourself at considerable risk." "I have been at considerable risk before," he said. "The difference is that this time I would be choosing it for the right reason." She held his gaze for a long moment in the afternoon light of the New Mexico territory and felt something settle in her own chest, the way ground settles after a long rain. "Thank you, Paul," she said. It was the first time she had used his name. He looked at her, and the still-water quality of his gray eyes shifted for just a moment, something moving underneath. "You are welcome, Susanna," he said. In the days that followed, Colt Draven did precisely what Paul had predicted and escalated. First, there was the matter of the water. The spring that fed Susanna's primary water trough was connected to a creek that ran through a notch in the Draven property's eastern boundary before reaching her land. She had a legal right to the water, documented and signed and filed with the county clerk, but legal rights and physical reality were separate things, as Draven clearly understood. On the fourth morning after the fence burning, she went to check the water level in the trough and found it low, and followed the creek line toward the notch and found a freshly built earthen dam that had been constructed overnight, diverting the flow of the creek away from the notch and toward Draven's lower pasture. She stood looking at it for a moment. Then she rode to Paul Keene's property. She found him in his workshop behind the house, a lean-to structure he had built himself, working on a cabinet for the Hendricks family. The smell of fresh wood shavings was on the air. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. "Water," she said, and he set down his plane without a word. They rode together to the dam. He looked at it with the appraising eye of a man who understands construction and said, 3 hours of labor to build, 1 hour to dismantle. If you do not care about being careful, they will rebuild it. Then we will dismantle it again," she said. "Or we document it and add it to the record." He pulled a small notebook from his jacket. He had it with him on 4 separate occasions now, and she had begun to understand that he carried it the way she carried her deed always, as a form of self-protection. She watched him write the date, the location, the description. His handwriting was precise and even, the handwriting of someone who had once been required to write things exactly. "What else do you have in that notebook?" she asked. He handed it to her. She opened it and read, and what she found was not simply notes about the current situation. It was the Colorado record he had mentioned, dates and names written in the same careful hand. A systematic account of everything he had participated in and witnessed over 7 years of working for a man named Gerard Holt, who had operated with the same methods and the same goals as Colt Draven. The entries went back to 1874. They were detailed and precise and unsparing about his own role, which she found to be more compelling evidence of their honesty than anything else. She handed the notebook back. "This is extraordinary, Paul." "It is a reckoning," he said quietly. "It has been waiting for a use." "Were there consequences for you when you left Holt?" Something crossed his face. "He threatened consequences. He had men watch me for about a year. And then I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Holt had been charged with fraud in Denver, unrelated to what I knew, and the watching stopped." He paused. "He is currently serving a sentence in the Colorado Territorial Prison." "And your testimony from the notebook was never needed?" "No." He looked at the diverted creek. "But the lessons in it are needed now." She reached out and put her hand on his arm briefly, the contact of one person telling another that she sees them and does not flinch at what she sees. He went very still at the touch, and she felt, through the fabric of his jacket, the slight shift in his breathing. She withdrew her hand, and they both looked at the dam as though they had agreed silently to redirect their attention. "I need to write to Santa Fe," she said. "The territorial magistrate, I need to begin that process." "I will help you draft the letter," he said. "Tonight, if you are willing." They sat at her kitchen table that evening with a lamp between them, and a sheet of paper, and a bottle of ink, and they composed the letter together. His knowledge of the legal precedents and her knowledge of the specific incidents combining into something that was considerably more formidable than either of them could have produced alone. She wrote the final copy in her own hand, which was clear and firm and authoritative, and folded it and sealed it and addressed it to the Honorable James Waverley, Territorial Magistrate, Santa Fe. Paul sat across the table from her while she sealed the letter, and she was aware, with the complete awareness of a woman who has been paying careful attention to herself, that she was profoundly comfortable with this man in a way that she had been with very few people in her adult life. He occupied space in her kitchen with an ease that did not crowd her, did not demand anything of the air around him, and she found that she had been sitting more comfortably in her own chair for the last 2 hours than she typically did when alone. She looked up and found him watching her with the gray eyes that she had been thinking about more than she intended to admit. "You are wondering what I am thinking," she said. "I was wondering no such thing," he said, with the trace of dry amusement she had come to recognize and unreasonably look forward to. "I was thinking about your roof, which has a section of shingles on the south side that are not going to survive another hard winter." She blinked. Then she laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that surprised her by coming up before she could moderate it, and she saw the way it changed his expression, something opening briefly in the careful architecture of his face before he pulled it back into order. "My roof," she said. "Third row from the ridge, south face," he said. "If you will allow me to look at it this weekend, I can tell you what needs replacing." She shook her head, smiling still. "You are a very unusual man, Paul Keene." "So I have been told," he said, usually with less pleasantness. "I did not say it unpleasantly." "No," he agreed, "you did not." The letter to Santa Fe went out on the morning stage the following day. They both knew it would take weeks, possibly months, to generate a response. In the meantime, Draven moved again. The second escalation was more personal and more frightening than the first. She came home from a supply run to Casado Springs to find that someone had been inside her house. Nothing was taken. That was the point. Someone had moved things subtly, a cup left on the wrong side of the table, a book placed face down when she never placed books face down, the deed removed from under the floorboard where she kept it and then replaced, but at a slightly different angle, enough for her to see it immediately. Her deed had been read, which meant Draven had seen exactly where her boundaries were drawn. She sat in her kitchen chair and felt the particular cold of this violation, not a theft but an intrusion, a demonstration of access that was meant to tell her exactly one thing: I can reach you whenever I choose. She sat for a long time. Then she rode to Paul Keene's. She told him what she had found and watched his face change, the calmness becoming something colder and more focused. "He is trying to terrify you into selling," Paul said. "It is working," she said honestly. He looked at her steadily. "Do you want to sell?" "No," she said, and the word came out with more force than she had intended, propelled by something deep and unequivocal. "No, I do not want to sell. This is my land. I built it. I earned it. I owe nobody anything, and I am not going to be driven off it by a man who has never once in his life understood that no is a complete sentence." Paul Keene looked at her across the several feet of afternoon light between them, and she saw clearly that he was not looking at her with pity or with caution, but with something that was very close to admiration, the kind that is not performed but simply present. "Then you need to be out of the house at night," he said. "Not always, not predictably, but enough that they cannot depend on knowing where you are." I am not going to let him drive me from my own bedroom, she said. No, he said. You are going to make their surveillance useless. That is different from being driven away. He paused. You can stay here when you need to. I have a spare room. My neighbor 2 properties over is a widow named Mrs. Calloway who has offered me the use of her spare room in the past in exchange for fence repair. I can make arrangements. I am not going to impose on you. You are not imposing. You are being strategic. He looked at her. Susanna, they broke into your house. You are allowed to be strategic. She pressed her lips together. Then she nodded. Over the following weeks, they developed a routine that was partly practical and partly something else that neither of them named. She stayed at her ranch most nights, but not all of them, occasionally staying in the spare room of Paul's modest house, where he slept on the other side of a wall, and she could hear his breathing slow in the quiet hours, and found that the sound of it settled her in a way she did not examine too closely. On the nights she stayed, they talked for long periods after supper, at the kitchen table or sometimes on the porch in the cooling evening, about things that had nothing to do with Draven and everything to do with who they were and who they were trying to become. She told him about her father and his books and the particular luxury of having a parent who respected her mind. She told him about James Alderidge, with less emotion than she had expected, and noticed that he listened without offering any of the standard male reassurances about how the other man had been a fool, which would have annoyed her. He simply listened, and at the end he said, "His loss became your independence," which was the most useful thing anyone had ever said to her about it. He told her about Colorado, more than he had at first, the specific texture of what it had meant to be young and poor, and told that the work he was doing was simply business, which was a word that could absorb a remarkable quantity of other people's suffering. He told her about the family who had lost their land, a woman named Maria Delgado and her 4 children, and the way the memory of Maria Delgado's face had followed him west and never quite let him stop moving until Casado Springs. She listened to all of it. She did not offer comfort exactly, but she did not shy away from the weight of it either, and he seemed to understand from the way she held the silence around his words that she was not dismissing what he felt and was not frightened by it. "Do you know what happened to her?" Susanna asked. "Maria Delgado. I found out eventually," he said. "She took her children to her sister in Albuquerque. I sent money for 3 years anonymously. I do not know if it helped." "It helped," she said. "Money sent in conscience always helps." He looked at her with a quiet directness. "You say that with considerable confidence." "Because I know what it is to need help from an unexpected direction," she said. "It changes the whole shape of your circumstances. Even a small change matters enormously." He held her gaze for a long moment. Across the table in the lamplight, she watched something shift in his expression and felt it shift reciprocally in her own chest. The same tectonic movement she had felt the first morning in the wagon, only closer now, more inevitable. He looked down at his coffee cup. She looked at her hands. "You should know," she said, with the directness of a woman who has learned that the only workable policy is honesty, "that I am not easy to be close to. I have been told this by multiple people. I am particular and independent, and I do not soften things when they do not deserve to be softened." "I know," he said. He did not look up immediately. "I have been paying attention." And now he looked up. "And I think those qualities are exactly what a person needs to survive what you are surviving, and I find them considerably more appealing than their absence." She absorbed that. "You are not saying it to flatter me." "No," he said with absolute seriousness. "I would be a poor flatterer. I have no talent for it." She smiled despite herself. "That is possibly the most accurate self-assessment I have ever heard from a man." The response from Santa Fe came on a Wednesday in late October, 6 weeks after the letter had gone out. It was addressed to Susanna Merriweather, which was proper, and it informed her that the Honorable James Waverley had received her complaint and was prepared to review the matter, and that a hearing would be scheduled for the 2nd week of January in the new year. An investigator from the territorial office, would be dispatched prior to the hearing to examine the physical evidence. She held the letter in her hands for a long time, standing in the doorway of the post office in Casado Springs, and felt something she had not allowed herself to feel since the night of the fire. Hope, actual, vulnerable, dangerous hope. She brought the letter to Paul's workshop and read it to him and watched his face as she read it, the way the careful stillness shifted into something warmer. "January," he said when she finished. "2 months," she said. "It is enough time. The investigator will be thorough if Waverly sent him. Waverly has a reputation for being clean." He paused. "We need to prepare a full record. Everything documented, dated, witnessed where possible." Walter Hendricks. "The night we went for lumber." "Yes, and the dam. I can testify to what I saw." He paused again. "My Colorado documentation will support the pattern argument that this is a method rather than a series of accidents." She looked at him. In the workshop light, surrounded by the smell of cedar and sawdust that had by now become so associated in her mind with his presence that she sometimes caught it in the wind and felt a specific warmth, she saw clearly what it cost him to offer that documentation publicly, to stand in front of a territorial investigator and say the words, "I participated in this, and here is the evidence." "Paul," she said, "you understand that using the Colorado record means answering for it." "Yes," he said without hesitation. "I understand that. It could have consequences for you, legal ones." "It could," he agreed. "I have thought about it. I have thought about it since the first morning." He met her eyes. "I also think that walking past something wrong because walking toward it costs something is precisely what I spent the last 7 years trying to stop doing." She crossed the workshop and stood in front of him, close enough that she had to tilt her chin slightly to hold his gaze. And what she was feeling was not careful and not calculated and not hedged by the 5 years of built walls. "You are a good man, Paul Keene," she said. "I am not sure you know how clearly that is visible from the outside." He looked at her, and the deep current stillness of his gray eyes was moving now, openly, like water that has stopped pretending to be still. "You see things very clearly," he said quietly. "I try to." They were standing close enough that she could see the old scar along his jaw and the slight imperfection in his left eyebrow, where it had been interrupted by something she would ask him about eventually. And she was aware of her own heartbeat in a way that she had not been in years, fully aware, specific and present. He raised his hand and very gently, with the deliberateness of a man doing something he has thought about and is choosing to do with his complete attention, touched her face, his fingertips at her jaw, barely contact, barely anything, and she leaned into it by perhaps a 1/4 inch, which was the most direct thing she had ever communicated without language. He bent his head and kissed her, carefully, a question and an answer simultaneously, and she put her hand against his chest and felt his heart, which was not calm at all, and kissed him back with all the directness that was her primary character trait, which apparently translated very effectively into the language they were currently speaking. When they stepped back from each other, there was a silence that was entirely different from the productive silences they had shared in the preceding weeks. It was a silence that held a great deal of weight, most of it golden. "I should mention," she said, with a steadiness she was proud of, "that I am still particular and independent, and I do not soften things." "I remember," he said, and the trace of dry amusement was in his voice, but warmer now, much warmer. "I am counting on it." She went back to her ranch that afternoon with the letter from Santa Fe in her pocket and something new and unguarded living in her chest, and she sat in her kitchen and looked at the ceiling and thought about the nature of hidden things and how they became unhidden, not always through force but sometimes through simple proximity and time and the repeated honest choice to be seen. Draven made 2 more moves before January. In November, he sent Haskell to Casado Springs with a story for anyone who would listen that Susanna Merriweather's land title had a defect in its original filing, which was entirely false, and which she was able to disprove at the county clerk's office with the original documents within 48 hours. but the story had circulated enough to cause two of the smaller ranchers who shared water rights along the creek to look at her with uncertainty. And uncertainty was the first step toward isolation, which was what Draven was building. Paul accompanied her to the county clerk's office and stood beside her while she laid out the documents, and the clerk, a meticulous man named Porter who was one of the few local officials Susanna trusted, confirmed the title's validity in writing and offered to send a copy of that confirmation to the territorial investigator, which she gratefully accepted. In December, Haskell came again, alone this time, and stopped outside the rebuilt fence line while Susanna was working in the yard. He looked at her for a moment and then said, with the specific menace of a man delivering words carefully chosen by someone else, "Mr. Draven says you should think about what happens to things out here that don't have anybody looking after them. Things can go wrong in the winter." She looked at Haskell with the full directness of her gaze and said, "Tell Mr. Draven that I have somebody looking after me, and tell him also that I have sent a full record of every incident of intimidation, including this conversation, to the territorial magistrate's office in Santa Fe." Haskell did not answer. He turned his horse and left. That evening she told Paul what had been said, and he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "I am going to be on your property at night until this is resolved. On the porch or in the barn. I will bring a bedroll, Paul." "It is not a discussion," he said, gently but completely without yield. "He just threatened your safety directly. I am not going to debate the appropriate response." She looked at him for a moment, then she said, "There is a proper room in the house, the one off the kitchen. It has a window that faces the yard." A pause, his gray eyes on her. "Susanna." "It is practical," she said, meeting his gaze with complete steadiness, though she could feel her pulse at the base of her throat. "The bedroom window faces the yard and the road. If something happened in the night, you would hear it faster from inside than from the porch." "That is practical," he agreed carefully. "And," she said and paused and chose the honest thing as she always chose it, "I would prefer to have you inside." He moved to her ranch house with a single bag and his bedroll and set himself up in the room off the kitchen, with the practicality of a man who intends to take this arrangement exactly as seriously as it deserves, which was very seriously indeed. He was on her property every night and most mornings, working on her roof in the afternoons as he had promised, replacing the south face shingles with careful precision, and she would look up from her own work and see him there and feel something settle in her that had been unsettled for years. There was nothing improper in their arrangement by any reasonable measure. Casado Springs was a small town and people noticed and talked, which she was aware of and entirely unbothered by, and Paul was equally unbothered, which she noted with appreciation. Mrs. Calloway, the widow neighbor, came to call one afternoon and looked at them both with the clear-eyed assessment of a woman who has lived long enough to know what she is looking at, and then smiled and accepted the coffee she was offered and stayed for 2 hours talking about the territorial hearing with a sharpness of legal understanding that surprised Susanna, until she learned that Mrs. Calloway had been a schoolteacher in Missouri and had followed her late husband west and had been navigating territorial law on her own property for 15 years. "You have your documentation in order?" Mrs. Calloway asked. "As thoroughly as we can manage," Paul said. "Good." She looked at him with the directness of an experienced judge of character. "And your Colorado records, you are certain you want to submit those?" A silence. He looked at the woman. "You know about that small town," she said simply, which was what he had said to Susanna on the first morning, and something about the echo of it made Susanna feel the world was tilting toward irony with intent. "You have a reputation for keeping to yourself, which in a small town means that people feel they need to find out why. There are stories about Colorado." She paused. "I found them unpersuasive in the direction of thinking badly of you. The fact that you kept records suggests a man who knew what he was doing was wrong while he was doing it." "Yes," Paul said quietly, "that is the most accurate and least comfortable summary of it." "Conscience has a cost," Mrs. Calloway said. "The people who pay it consistently are rarer than they should be." She set down her cup. Submit the records. Waverly is clean and he has seen these patterns before. It will help Miss Merriweather, and it will go better for you in the long run to bring it out yourself rather than have it found." After she left, Susanna looked at Paul across the kitchen table and said, "I like her very much." "She is formidable," he agreed. "I want to be formidable at 70, she said. He looked at her across the table with gray eyes warm with something that had long since stopped being hidden. "You are formidable now," he said, "at whatever age you currently are." She was 28. She had not told him this. 28, she said. He nodded. "I am 31, he said. "In case you were doing the arithmetic." She smiled. She had been doing the arithmetic for approximately 6 weeks. The territorial investigator arrived in the 3rd week of December. A compact and serious man named Harold Fitch, who wore a good coat and kept a notebook that reminded her, with a warmth she did not suppress, of Paul's. He spent 4 days in Casado Springs and the surrounding area, inspecting the burned fence line where the char marks were still visible in the ground, examining the diverted creek dam which had been rebuilt twice more and dismantled twice more and each time documented, speaking to Walter Hendricks and to the county clerk Porter and to Mrs. Calloway and to Emilio Vargas's daughter, who had a sharp and loyal memory of what her father had told her about the history of Draven's campaign against Susanna's land. He also spoke to Paul Keene for 3 hours in Paul's workshop, with the door closed, and when Paul emerged afterward he looked steady but tired in the way of a man who has said something difficult and knows he cannot take it back, which is not the same as wishing he could. She was waiting on the bench outside with the December cold moving through her coat. He sat beside her. "He took everything," Paul said. "The notebook. He said the Colorado material is exactly what they needed to establish the pattern. Are you all right?" He looked out at the quiet main street of Casado Springs, the mercantile and the post office and the saloon and the hardware store standing in the winter afternoon. "I am," he said. "I am more all right than I have been in a long time, actually." He paused. "Fitch told me the Colorado matter has been formally reviewed as part of Holt's case. My cooperation with the original investigation was noted. There are no charges pending against me." She took his hand. Not briefly, not as a passing contact, but fully, her fingers laced through his, and she felt him hold it with an answering pressure that was not urgent but was complete. "Good," she said. "He did say," Paul continued, and there was a restraint in his voice that she recognized as the suppression of something he was not certain how to deliver, "that Draven is going to face charges. Not just the civil land dispute, the break-in to your house, the arson, which is what burning the fence constitutes in law, the water diversion." He paused. Haskell apparently talked. Fitch interviewed him separately and Haskell talked. She absorbed this. When? Before the January hearing. Fitch said the criminal charges will move faster than the civil review. Draven may be taken into custody before the new year. She sat for a moment with the afternoon cold, and the sound of Casado Springs going about its business around them, and the warmth of his hand in hers, and the particular feeling of something very large and very heavy being slowly, deliberately lifted from the ground. "Paul," she said. "Yes, thank you." He turned to look at her, and there was something in his face that was completely without the careful management she had first observed in him, open and present and specific and entirely directed at her. "You did this," he said. "You rode for lumber before dawn, you documented everything, you wrote to Santa Fe, you refused to sell when selling would have been the easier thing. I just helped." "You did considerably more than help," she said. "I had a great deal of personal motivation," he said, which was the most direct thing either of them had said about the nature of what existed between them since the kiss in the workshop, and she felt it move through her like the first warm day after a hard winter. "As did I," she said. He lifted their joined hands and pressed his lips briefly to the back of hers, in the middle of the Casado Springs main street on a December afternoon, where anyone who cared to look could see them, and she thought that there was something appropriate about that, about being seen doing something that did not need to be hidden. Colt Draven was arrested on December 28th, 1881, by the territorial sheriff's deputy who rode out from Santa Fe with a warrant that covered arson, breaking and entering, water rights violation, and conspiracy to commit property fraud. Haskell was arrested the same morning at the Draven Ranch. Two of Draven's other men who had been present at the fence burning identified themselves voluntarily to the deputy in exchange for lesser charges, and their testimony added another layer to what was already a formidable case. She heard about it from Paul, who heard about it from Walter Hendricks, who had been at the Casado Springs post office when the deputy rode through, and had watched the whole thing from the window with what he later described as significant satisfaction. She stood in her yard in the cold December morning and looked at her rebuilt fence line and the ranch house with its new south-face shingles and the winter grass that was brown but not dead and would come back green in the spring. And she felt something open in her chest that was not relief exactly, but was the particular sensation of air reaching a place that has been closed for too long. Paul came out of the house behind her with 2 cups of coffee, which he had made because he had taken to making the morning coffee in the way that a person takes to doing small things that matter, deliberately and without announcement, and handed her one. They stood side by side in the cold morning looking at the land. "What will you do with the east boundary?" he asked. "The parcel he claimed is rightfully yours once the survey is confirmed." "Expand the herd," she said. "I have been running 12 head on land that could support 30, and I want to put in a proper kitchen garden on the eastern flat." "There is a spring on the eastern flat," he said. "Closer to the surface than the main one if you wanted a proper well dug." "I know," she said. "Emilio told me about it." He sipped his coffee. She sipped hers. The morning moved around them with the particular quiet of winter in the New Mexico territory, the dry cold air and the big sky and the red earth in every direction. "I have been thinking," he said, about whether there is a use for a carpenter who intends to stay in one place." She looked at him sideways. He was looking straight ahead. The morning light was on the side of his face. "What sort of use?" she said carefully. "The kind that involves building things meant to last," he said. "A proper barn if the herd is going to expand. A well house over the eastern spring. Possibly." He paused, and there was the trace of the dry amusement she had been looking forward to for 3 months. "A few repairs to that kitchen floor that has a soft spot near the stove that I have been walking around carefully for 6 weeks." "The kitchen floor," she said. "And any number of other things," he said, and now he looked at her directly, the gray eyes clear in the morning light. "If the rancher who owns the property has a use for someone who intends to be here longer than 6 weeks." She looked at him for a long moment. The cold was on her face, and his coffee was steaming between his hands, and she felt absolutely, completely, unflinchingly certain. "The rancher has a use for that," she said, "and for the someone in question specifically." He smiled. It was not the first time she had seen him smile, but it was the first time she had seen him smile without anything behind it, without the careful management or the weight of Colorado or the particular loneliness of a man who has been keeping to himself. It was simply a smile, warm and real and entirely for her. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him with the ease of something that has been true for a long time finally being acknowledged, and they stood together in the January cold of the New Mexico territory looking at her land. The territorial hearing in January confirmed everything. The magistrate Waverly reviewed the full record, including Fitch's investigative report and Paul's Colorado documentation, and ruled comprehensively in Susanna's favor. The disputed eastern boundary was confirmed at the original survey line. The water rights were confirmed, and an injunction placed against any future diversion. Draven's criminal trial, which would take place in Santa Fe in March, was a separate matter, but the civil ruling was immediate and binding. Susanna sat in the hearing room in Santa Fe in her good coat, which she had bought for the occasion at the Mercantile in Casado Springs, and listened to Waverly read the ruling in his dry, precise voice, and kept her face composed until she was outside on the street where Paul was waiting. And then she breathed out for what felt like the first full exhale she had taken in 2 years. He was there immediately, his hands on her shoulders, reading her face with the particular attention he had developed for that purpose. "Everything," she said. He closed his eyes briefly. Then he pulled her into his arms on the Santa Fe Street in front of the territorial courthouse, and she let herself be held in a way she had not let herself be held since before Kansas, and felt the warmth of it go all the way through to the part of her that had been cold for a long time. "Come on," he said, into her hair. "There is a decent restaurant 2 streets over that Walter Hendricks recommended, and I intend to buy you the best meal this city has to offer." She laughed against his chest. "Is that the sum of your plans for the occasion?" "That," he said, "and one other thing." He stepped back and held her at arm's length and looked at her with the gray eyes that she had catalogued over the preceding months into a private record of their variations, the different qualities of stillness and depth and warmth, and this particular version she had not seen before. This one was entirely unguarded. This one was afraid in the way that only something real and important can make a person afraid. "I know that you are particular and independent, and that you do not soften things," he said, with a seriousness that made her heart do something complex and irreversible. "I know that you built something from nothing, and you do not need anyone, and that you have excellent reasons for keeping the architecture of your life exactly as you have constructed it." "Paul," she said softly. "I also know," he continued, with the inexorable manner of a man who has decided to say the complete truth and will not be interrupted partway through, "that I came to Casado Springs to be someone different, and that the person I have been since the night you rode past my window is the closest I have come to that, and that it is entirely because of you. The particular way that you are, all of it, the directness and the stubbornness and the laugh that surprises you when it comes out and the way you hold silences when someone is telling you something that matters." He stopped. The Santa Fe Street moved around them, indifferent. "I love you, Susanna Merriweather. I would very much like to know if there is any possibility that you might choose to build something with me, the way you build everything, deliberately and to last." She stood for a moment in the January cold of Santa Fe, looking at Paul Keene. "You said you have no talent for flattery," she said. "That was not flattery," he said. "That was an honest account of the facts." "I know," she said. "That is why it is so effective." She stepped toward him and put both her hands against his chest and looked up at his face with the full force of everything she had been paying careful attention to for the past months. "I love you. I have been arriving at that conclusion by logical steps for approximately 12 weeks, and I have been delaying saying it because I wanted to be certain, and I am now thoroughly certain and also slightly furious with myself for taking so long." He looked at her with wonder and the warmth she had learned to read in him. "Why furious?" "Because the evidence was completely clear by week 6, she said. "I was simply being overly rigorous." He laughed. It was the sound she had been working toward without knowing it, open and real and all the way through. He bent and kissed her in the middle of the Santa Fe Street, and she kissed him back with the complete honesty of someone who has stopped hedging, and the January cold was nothing against it. He proposed properly, on a Sunday in February, on the porch of her ranch house with the morning light on the red earth and Clover watching from the corral, with the mild curiosity of a horse that has seen many things. He did not have a ring prepared, which he apologized for, and she told him that she would prefer to choose her own ring when they went to the jeweler, which she thought surprised him slightly and pleased him considerably. She said yes. The word came out as simply and as certainly as any word she had ever spoken. They were married in April of 1882 in the Casado Springs church that was somewhat unfinished on the interior, because the town's only carpenter had been otherwise occupied through the winter, a fact that drew knowing smiles from everyone who attended, which included Walter Hendricks and his wife, Mrs. Calloway, the county clerk porter, Harold Fitch, the territorial investigator who had made a point of attending, Emilio Vargas's daughter Elena, who came in her father's place and wept openly and happily, and approximately 40 other residents of Casado Springs and the surrounding range. Paul had finished the church interior in the 3 weeks before the wedding, working early and late, and Susanna had come by to check on his progress, and found him installing the last of the pew benches with the same precise care he brought to everything he built. And she had leaned in the doorway watching him for several minutes before he heard her and turned, and the expression on his face was the one that had been there since Santa Fe, the unguarded version, the one she had made a private study of. The ceremony was simple and honest, which was the only kind either of them wanted. The minister, a young man named Reverend Alcott, who had been in Casado Springs for less than a year and was still finding his footing, asked them each in turn whether they took the other as lawful spouse to have and to hold from this day forward, and they both said yes with the calm certainty of people who have already made the decision in full and are simply making it public. She wore her good coat over a dress she had ordered from the catalog, blue wool, which Paul had told her the previous evening was his favorite color without knowing it would be relevant, which she found quietly delightful. He wore the good suit he had made in Santa Fe at the same time she was buying her coat, which she had not known about at the time, and which she noted fit him exceptionally well. After the ceremony, they stood on the church steps in the April sunshine, and received the genuine happiness of people who had watched the winter's events unfold with concern and were relieved at the outcome. And Mrs. Calloway hugged Susanna with the warmth of a woman who had become a genuine friend, and Walter Hendricks shook Paul's hand and said something in his ear that made Paul laugh, which she made a note to ask about later. She asked later. He said that the night we came for lumber in the dark before dawn he knew, Paul told her. He said no two people who didn't care about each other would have loaded that much timber with that much cooperation at that hour of the morning. She thought about the morning, the cedar posts, the cold air, the efficient and comfortable silence of two people working toward the same thing. He was right, she said. He usually is, Paul agreed. He is an extremely perceptive man for a lumber merchant. They lived in her ranch house, which was the sensible choice, and Paul kept his own property and converted the workshop into a proper carpentry business that served the growing needs of Casado Springs and the surrounding range, building everything from furniture to fence systems to, eventually, a proper school building when the town grew enough to need one. He came home every evening to her kitchen table and the coffee she made, because she had taken to making the evening coffee the way he made the morning coffee, deliberately and without announcement, a small declaration in an ongoing language. The eastern boundary was fenced properly in the spring with cedar posts set by both of them on a cool April morning before the ceremony, the new posts standing clean and straight along the confirmed boundary, and she expanded the herd to 22 head by midsummer and to 31 by the following spring, exactly as she had planned. The kitchen garden on the eastern flat came in well that first summer, beans and corn and squash, and a long row of tomatoes that produced more than she could use, and which she brought to the Casado Springs Mercantile in exchange for credit. The well on the eastern flat was dug by a man Paul hired from Santa Fe in the summer of 1882, a professional well digger who confirmed what the surface evidence had suggested, a good strong spring, and the well house that Paul built over it was solid and neat, and had a peculiar little decorative detail along the roofline that she teased him about, and which he defended on purely aesthetic grounds with an earnestness she found endearing. Colt Draven was convicted in the Santa Fe criminal proceedings in March of 1882 and sentenced to 18 months in the territorial prison on the arson and conspiracy charges. Haskell received 12 months. The Draven Ranch, which Draven had run on significant credit, was sold by his creditors while he was imprisoned, and the land was purchased in parcels by 3 of the smaller neighboring ranchers who had long been crowded by his operations. The territory, without Draven in it, felt larger. She did not celebrate this, Exactly. She noted it with the same precise attention she gave to all information and moved forward. In the autumn of 1882, with the harvest in and the herd settled and Paul's carpentry business established enough to turn a solid profit, she sat in her kitchen one evening while he read at the table beside her, and she was aware of the particular quality of contentment she was living inside, the kind that has been built rather than found, specific and durable and entirely real. She said, "I want to write to Elena Vargas about her father." He looked up from his book. "How is he doing?" "The stroke left him limited," she said. "Elena manages the ranch now. She is doing it well from what I hear, but it is a great deal for one person." She paused. "I want to offer them the use of our eastern spring. There is more water than we need and their south grazing pasture is running dry." He nodded. "Good idea. I also want to send her some of the hay we have left from last winter. We have more than enough carried over." He looked at her across the table with the warm directness she had long since stopped being surprised by but had not yet become accustomed to in the best possible way. "Write the letter tonight," he said. "I will deliver it in the morning." She did. Elena Vargas responded with a gratitude that was reserved and dignified and real, and over the following months she became a frequent presence on the Merriweather Keene property, which was what the deed began to read after Susanna formally added his name to it in the county clerk's office, an act that she accomplished with a pen and a steady hand and a feeling of rightness that sat in her chest like ballast. It was Elena who was there, along with Mrs. Calloway, on a morning in June of 1883, when Susanna gave birth to their first child, a boy, healthy and loud and abundantly present, who arrived into the world in the upstairs bedroom of the ranch house, with the full-throated conviction of someone who intends to make his presence known. Paul was in the house, which had been Elena's practical insistence and Mrs. Calloway's iron requirement. And when Mrs. Calloway came to the top of the stairs and called down to him, he came up the stairs two at a time with a speed that she observed through the doorway and found completely characteristic. He came into the room and looked at her, and at the child in her arms, and his face did the thing it did when something reached the part of him that was not managed or careful, and she watched it happen with the full and grateful attention of a woman who has made a study of a face and considers this the best use of her attention that has ever been available to her. "He looks very serious," Paul said, coming to sit beside her. "He looks like he has strong opinions," she said. "Which I understand to be a family trait." He touched the baby's face with one careful finger. "Hello," he said quietly to the child, in the tone a person uses when they are speaking to someone who matters completely. They named him Thomas, after no one in particular, but because it was a good solid name that wore well. Thomas was 8 months old when Susanna rode out one December morning to check the east fence line, and found a section of wire down, not damaged but simply needing to be re-anchored at 2 posts, and she dismounted and pulled the wire staples from her coat pocket, and fixed it with her pliers with Thomas secured in the carrier she had made from canvas and leather that let her work with both hands while he slept against her chest. And when she was done, she looked out across the eastern flat at the winter grass and the bare juniper, and the wide red earth running to the horizon, and felt the particular satisfaction of something built and maintained in hers. She rode back to the house where Paul was working on a cabinet order in the workshop, and Thomas woke up when she dismounted, as he invariably did, and made his opinion of being woken from a warm doze known in clear vocal terms. Paul came out of the workshop at the sound and looked at them both with the warm attention that had not diminished in the 1.75 years since Santa Fe. "Fence?" he asked. "Wire down on the east line. Fixed." "Thomas." "Opinions," she said. He took the baby from the carrier with the ease of a man who has become entirely comfortable with small, determined persons, and Thomas stopped making his opinions known immediately, because Paul had a particular and thoroughly unfair ability to calm the child in a way that Susanna found both admirable and slightly annoying. "You are spoiling him," she said. "Thoroughly," he agreed, without any sign of remorse. She looked at them both in the December morning, her husband and her son, and the wide New Mexico sky behind them. By the spring of 1884, Susanna was carrying their second child, and the herd was at 38 head, and Paul had taken on an apprentice from Casado Springs, a 17-year-old boy named Domingo Vargas, who was Alina's nephew, and who had a natural talent for woodworking that Paul recognized and nurtured with the patient specificity of a teacher who has thought carefully about what teaching is. Emilio Vargas died in January of 1884, peacefully, in the bed in his daughter's house, with Alina beside him. He had lasted longer than the doctors predicted after the stroke, long enough to see the Draven matter resolved, which she had always suspected he had decided to do on purpose. She went to his funeral with Paul and stood in the cold January air at the grave and thought about everything he had given her, all the knowledge that was not in books, the reading of the grass and the water and the seasons, and felt the weight of real grief and real gratitude simultaneously. Alina stood beside her with the composed dignity of a woman who has been preparing herself for a loss she has seen coming, and Susanna pressed her hand, and Alina pressed back, and they stood together in the cold. The second child was born in September of 1884, a girl this time, who arrived in the world with the same loud opinions as her brother, but expressed them in a higher register that Thomas, now 14 months and a serious small person, observed from his corner of the room with the look of someone cataloging new information. They named her Clara, which had been Paul's mother's name, and she had her father's gray eyes and her mother's particular expression of assessment, which she deployed from approximately 6 weeks old on anyone who entered her field of vision. She is already judging people, Paul noted at one point, watching Clara examine the face of Walter Hendricks, who had come to call with his wife. That is a useful skill, Susanna said. In you, absolutely, he said. In a 6-week-old, it is slightly unnerving. Thomas adjusted to Clara with more grace than they had anticipated, which Mrs. Calloway said was a result of good parenting, and which Paul said was a result of Thomas's fundamentally sensible nature, and which Susanna said was too early to attribute to anything definitive, because she preferred not to reach conclusions before the data was sufficient. Paul looked at her when she said this, and smiled in the way he smiled when she said something that was completely and particularly herself, and she felt the warmth of being entirely known and entirely accepted as the specific comfortable weight it was. Domingo Vargas completed his apprenticeship in the spring of 1885 and opened his own small carpentry shop in Casado Springs with Paul's assistance and endorsement, and the town had 2 carpenters for the first time, which was necessary because the town had been growing. A new school, a new church addition, 3 new houses along the South Road, a proper hotel that had been discussed for years and was finally under construction by a businessman from Albuquerque who had heard that Casado Springs was the kind of stable, productive community where investment made sense. The stability of the community was, in part, a consequence of the Draven matter being resolved, which several people said openly, and at least as many thought privately. The territory without the pressure of that particular kind of predatory acquisition had room to breathe, and things that had been crowded grew. On a Sunday morning in October of 1885, Susanna Merriweather Keene sat on the porch of her ranch house in the autumn light with Paul beside her and Thomas in the yard, investigating a beetle with the serious interest of a 2-year-old scientist, and Clara sleeping in the cradle just inside the door, and a cup of coffee cooling in her hand. And she looked out at the 340 acres that had once been the entire measure of what she had, and was now simply the ground floor of what she was building. The eastern flat was in full production. The herd was strong. The fence line stood straight and cedar solid along all their boundaries. The well house on the eastern spring was weathering its 3rd winter with no trouble. The south face shingles Paul had replaced in the first autumn were still sound. She had a letter in her pocket from Alina Vargas, who had written to tell her that she was considering a proposal of marriage from a quiet and decent man who ran the postal service in a town 40 miles south, and who had asked for Susanna's opinion, which Susanna had found deeply moving, because asking for an opinion implied the kind of friendship that makes one's judgment valuable, and she had written back with everything honest and encouraging she could find to say, which was considerable. She had a second letter in her pocket from the Honorable James Waverley's office in Santa Fe, informing her that the full civil case regarding the Draven land dispute had been formally closed in her complete favor and all documentation filed and sealed. It was a letter she had been expecting for months and which had arrived with the particular satisfaction of a thing completed properly. She held her coffee. The October morning was gentle and golden. "What are you thinking?" Paul asked from beside her. "I was thinking," she said, watching Thomas crouch more closely over the beetle, "that I am going to need more fence posts by spring if I expand the north pasture." He turned to look at her with the full gray warmth of his gaze. "That is what you are thinking on a Sunday morning in October." "Also," she said, "I was thinking that I have been more completely happy for the last 3 years than I knew was available to a person, and that I am aware of it, which I believe is important, because happiness that goes unnoticed does not accumulate properly." He was quiet for a moment. "That is a very Susanna Merriweather way of describing happiness," he said. "Is it wrong?" "Not in the slightest," he said. He reached across and took her hand, the one that was not holding the coffee, and held it with the same completeness he had held it on the bench in Casado Springs after Fitch's interview, not urgent but entire. "I have the same accumulated total," he said, "in case the data is relevant to your assessment." "It is very relevant," she said. Thomas stood up from his investigation and turned and walked back across the yard toward the porch with the determined gait of someone who has business to conduct, and climbed the 2 steps and looked at both of them with the expression of a child who is deciding whether the adults have anything useful to offer, and then sat down between them on the porch floor and leaned against Paul's leg and immediately tried to take Paul's coffee. "That is not for you," Paul said, moving the cup, and Thomas expressed his view of this policy in clear terms, and Clara, hearing her brother's voice from inside, woke up and made her own contribution to the morning, and the porch was suddenly full of sound and small necessary demands, and the particular joyful chaos of a life that has more in it than one person can hold alone. Susanna Merriweather Keene set down her coffee and picked up her daughter and settled her against her shoulder and looked at her husband over the top of Clara's dark head, and Paul was looking back at her with the gray eyes that she had never once, in all the months and years of looking at them, found anything other than exactly what they were. The morning moved around them. The New Mexico sky was enormous and blue and indifferent and kind. The fence line stood. The cattle grazed the eastern flat where the spring fed a clean, steady current of good water. The cedar posts were solid in the ground. She had built something meant to last. So had he. And they had built the best parts of it together, which was, she had come to understand with the precision that was her primary nature, the whole point of all of it, not the land or the deed or the resolved legal case, or even the accumulated satisfaction of having fought and won a thing that deserved to be won, but the particular irreplaceable fact of a person beside you who sees you exactly as you are and stays. Paul Keene had found her in the dark and laced his boots and followed her toward the thing that needed doing, and she had let him, and all the rest had grown from that, the way good things grow in the right conditions, steadily and without requiring permission. She kissed the top of her daughter's head. Her son leaned further into his father's side. The morning went on, and in the wide, clean country of the New Mexico Territory, in the autumn of the year 1885, on a porch that had been repaired, and a land that had been fought for, and a life that had been built by 2 stubborn and careful and finally unguarded people, everything that had been earned was held, and the holding was easy, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was everything.